Hey guys, so some of you may have had a play around with the deep research feature that OpenAI and Perplexity put out back in February. Well, today I'm going to run you through how you can implement your own version of deep research from the ground up using an agentic framework in under 10 minutes. We're going to walk through how deep research works in practice, and then we're going to go through a full working code example in Python, which is around 100 lines of code, so really easy to implement. I'll also walk you through what you can do to make it more sophisticated and more performant going forward, along with a full open source deep research package that you can play around with if it's of interest. So let's dive straight in. So just before we jump into the implementation, I wanted to give a quick example of the sort of output that the deep researcher we're going to produce can put out. This is an example of a report that took around 1 minute to build. You can see it produces these sort of longer form responses with markdown headings, with inline citations so that you can examine the source content, and also things like tables for comparisons. This would be quite a bit longer than the typical response that you'd get from a one-shot ChatGPT query. Okay, so how does deep research work? Well, to understand that, we first need to go through how things work without deep research. Now, if I go on ChatGPT and send a query to the LLM, I can select which model is going to be processing the response. And all that happens is that query gets sent to an LLM for processing. That LLM is building a bunch of predictions about the next token to output, and it streams a response back to me as the user. And that is essentially a one-step process. I send a query and I get a response. Well, when it comes to deep research, things are a little bit more complicated. Instead of just having a single LLM or a single agent processing the user request, what you actually have is a team of agents that work together and pass information between each other to iteratively address the user query. So I, as the user, send a query, and that actually goes into a research loop. And that research loop, this is a simple version of deep research, has just two agents. A thinking and planning agent, which reflects on the progress so far in the research and determines the next research topic to deep dive into. It then passes that information onto a research agent, which might have access to things like a web search or a Google search, runs those searches, collects findings, and sends it back to the thinking and planning agent. And that process iterates a certain number of times, and each time the thinking and planning agent has more information to work with and can suggest diving deeper into different topics to address the query. Once you've gone through a certain number of iterations, you then pass on all the findings to the third and final agent, which is a writer agent, which consolidates all of that into a report. So we're just going to work with 3 agents in this case. You could build something more complex, but in the first instance, this is sufficient. So let's look at what that looks like with some real code. Now we're going to be using the OpenAI Agents SDK to build this out. It's an agent framework. There are many of these available. You could use Pydantic AI. You could use LangChain or LangGraph to do this. I've opted to use the OpenAI Agents SDK because it's actually very simple to work with and get running. Now, the way it works is we just need to define these 3 agents up front. An agent, in this case, is just an LLM with a bunch of tools available to it and a predefined role or system prompt. So when we're building an agent, all we need to feed it is a name for the agent, a set of instructions which form the system prompt for that LLM. We can optionally define an output type. By default, it'll just output a string, but if you want to provide some structure to the output, then you can actually define the output as a custom Pydantic class, which is what we've done here. And then you need to specify the model to be used. In this case, for the thinking agent, we've defined O3 Mini because it needs to do a little bit of reasoning, but you can even use non-OpenAI models. You can also use local models that are deployed on the user's system to do this. The last thing that you can provide the agent optionally are a set of tools. Now, the thinking agent in this case doesn't have access to any tools, but for the sake of argument, you could say that I want this agent to have access, for example, to a web search tool, which would enable it to run web searches and have access to specific services. But that's not necessary for the thinking agent. So for the thinking agent, what do we do? Well, we just describe to it what its objective is and what the guidelines are. And I tend to format the system prompts as you see here, with a little bit of preamble on what the role of the agent is. In this case, it's an expert researcher conducting deep research in iterations. I then give it an objective. So in the case of the thinking agent, provide your thoughts on the next logical subtopic to research. And then I provide a set of guidelines. So in this case, in the guidelines, I also say you should provide your thinking and justifications. And that's that. And that produces a thinker output. That is the type we've defined for the output. That defines our thinker agent. We then have our two other agents to define. First, the researcher agent. And this researcher agent has access to a web search tool, as we'd mentioned earlier. And same again, we define the instructions for this, follows the same format. It's given a user query, it's given a specific topic and the reasoning for that topic. And then it's given an objective, which is to go out, search the web on that topic or subtopic, summarize its findings, and spit that out. And we, in this case, define the output as a structured output with a summary of findings and a list of sources for those findings. In this case, we're actually using a search tool, which is a built-in search tool provided by OpenAI's responses API called the web search tool. But you could actually define this to be whatever custom function that you want to write that you can feed to the agent. Finally, we define the writer agent. This one's really simple. It just has the objective of consolidating all of the findings that has been provided as an input and producing a markdown report as output. You'll actually notice that we're using GPT-4o Mini for both the researcher agent and the writer agent. And that's because, we have agents with very narrowly defined tasks. And actually, what I've found anecdotally is that you don't need really big, expensive models to run these defined tasks. As long as they're good at doing things like tool calling, they're actually very performant. So you can run deep research at relatively low cost by opting for these cheaper models. So we've defined the three agents. Now all we have to do is create the research loop. And the way that I do that is actually by defining a class called the deep researcher, which we initiate with an empty set of thoughts and findings. The thoughts are what will be produced by the thinker agent. The findings are what will be produced by the researcher agent. And once we've initialized the class, we simply run it. And as you'll recall, we have our research loop, which iterates through those two agents here. And then once it's gone through a certain number of iterations, it spits out all the findings to a writer agent. And that's exactly what we do here. We have a while loop, which iterates through the thinking and the research a certain number of times, and then it increments the iteration number, and once it reaches a certain limit, it simply outputs to the writer agent. And all those things are doing are, essentially compiling the prompt for each of those agents, spitting in all of the context, and then running that agent using the runner class, which is a specific class to run these predefined agents from the OpenAI Agents SDK. We define that for the researcher. We define that here for the thinker agent, where we're just building up the context, passing on the information to the other. And then we also define that for the writer. Those things run in a loop, and it should all kind of sit together and work very nicely. And then all we do at the end is we're going to write that final output to a markdown report. So we're done. So all that's left to do is run that file, which will kick off the deep researcher. And what you should now see with each iteration of research is a printout to the console of the next subtopic that's been selected for research, some accompanying rationale, and as each iteration passes through, that subtopic and rationale should become deeper and more expansive around the query topic. And there you go. Once it's done, the final output is written to a file, and there you'll be able to look at the final report. You'll find a link in the description below that includes all of the code that we went through in this video. And I've also included a link to a much more sophisticated deep research implementation that I put together that has a lot more advanced features, so check that out as well if you're interested. I hope you found this useful. If you did, I'd really appreciate if you could like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.